There's been a revolution of white women who are now revealing themselves to hate people of color or not have empathy for people of color and their struggle in this country and Black people. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump converted all these white women into Trumpism, where in reality, that's what's been going on forever.
Mm-hmm.
So much. Oh my God. So when the exit poll came out about that, and we had so many great people in this conversation I started on Clubhouse, I titled it White Women Explain Yourselves, and had them come up on stage and give a take on it, why there was an increase. And again, there was somebody who does data science, and they said, hold off for a second while we wait for polls that come in that aren't as reflective of a Republican voting bloc. But two, it should have been a smash, like you were saying, Aida, in the other direction for all the ways that their narratives and voices were centered in Time's Up, in Me Too, as we saw Alyssa Milano kind of jumped on and tried to take on Me Too. And then it took a minute for folks to center the actual person who started it, who was Tarana Burke, right? And so what we have to ask ourselves is, what is the work white women are willing to do with their communities? And that's a question I still don't have an answer from the white women who are around me. What does it look like for folks to go back to the places, like if you're in LA and New York, where are your homes? Are you from the Midwest? Are you from the South? What does it look like for you to go back and actually do the work to educate, to organize? If you say you want to be about this movement, then you have to do the work like we've been doing in our communities. I'll give you an example. Like, as I've been mentioning, the Arab American community was solidly Republican until George Bush's first year. Clearly, we know his response, one, to 9/11, to criminalizing Arabs and Muslims. And so steadily, they've changed their alliances and allegiances more with a left-wing politic, even though for most cases, those communities are pretty socially conservative and fiscally conservative, but we've convinced them as organizers to think more deeply about how voting for Republicanism is a vote for white supremacy. And I mean that. I mean, this is what the party has really been about for the last couple of decades. So what I think I've been pressing, as I said, upon white women is to do the unglamorous work, to not be in the public stage. And that's what we have to do, to say, like, if you want to be in our spaces, one, don't talk for us. put us up in front and center. Put the most vulnerable, the most impacted folks front and center, and find every way to uplift their voices in the work that they do. Now people are talking about Stacey Abrams. We should have been talking about Stacey Abrams forever. And it's not just Stacey Abrams, it's a movement of folks doing this work. Yeah. So that's the unglamorous stuff they have to do. And unfortunately, I think that some of them believe that just getting on Twitter or doing an IG live is enough work. They have to roll up their sleeves and go into community.
Yeah.
You get, Francis, you get them. You go at them. You got them.
Yeah.
I'm enamored with your take sometimes.
I mean, I always I get stopped in the street after I first started doing videos. And I remember I was asked by the person who was watching, he's like, what do you deal with like who's your audience? Like, is it like Black people? Because it's a Black guy that was speaking to me. And I was like, man, like, no offense, I love people watching me. Of course, I want anybody to watch me. One, he was telling me that he gets his news from me. So the first thing I did was tell him I'm not news. Like, that's a big problem on its own. The fact that people would see me as a news source. I'm not. But then I got into a great conversation. And I talked about how my audience, to me, was always clearly white people. Like, my job is not to tell people of color that, hey, you're oppressed, because they know that. They've been telling that for years and trying and working, as was said there, within communities to organize, to try to raise their voices, because oftentimes people who look like me, white men and white women, they would not be inclusive to any groups, and they would not want to hear it because they didn't have to. They were already in the groups. They were the people who assumed to be in power and were given all the opportunities to have their voice heard from the beginning. Yeah, you could, obviously there's a case to be made that it was white men to begin with, and white women, as you mentioned, Aida, have been the target of this Karen campaign. But that's because one of the most frustrating things that I think comes up from especially a Donald Trump presidency is they almost like remove the parts of the things that he stands for and the things that go along with white supremacy that directly impact women. Like there's someone who's set to take a lifelong position in the Supreme Court who's talked in being cloudy on a policy that removes the rights of women to control their own bodies. And to have that conversation, especially with white women, it's almost like they remove those parts of white supremacy because they then subscribe to other parts of it where and unfortunately, it's always going to be that there is that racial prejudice that is so ingrained in this country. It's a stain. That one of the best videos I've seen in response to this election, but also just in shared perspective, was Eddie Glade's opinion that he did on MSNBC. It was absolutely outstanding, and it was so groundbreaking to so many people. But they were like, the point was, how is that groundbreaking to you? Have you really been paying attention? Like his whole point was that this has been happening, and Donald Trump is just a manifestation of a new form of it, and an updated form, a different voice that's going to be put to it. But it's been happening across this country since its beginning. This is who we are. So to go back to the original point of what I would try to do is, because I look a certain way to a certain group of people, I would always get pushback saying, why are you going against your own people? And I would always be like, my own people, mate, I'm Scottish. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't put me in to that group. Like, I'm not going against Willie Wallace and the rest of my people. I'm going against people in this country who far too often have not been forced to look at themselves and their own role. And even boiling that down, it wasn't just going after people who hold a certain prejudice. It was going after the moderates, the people that will share a Black Lives Matter square on Instagram, but then avoid the actual work that goes every single day to actively be anti-racist. That is the big factor. I had to learn myself that the things that I was taught, even in Scotland, even across the world, were bathed in a sense of supremacy. And I had to unlearn those things. And that is what it is. It's an act of unlearning. And to unlearn, you have to be humble. You have to be willing to see your own faults, which, as we know, as you mentioned, Aida, it goes along with the sense of misogyny that goes hand in hand with white supremacy, and the ego that goes along with it, and this sense of superiority where they don't want to check themselves because we're perfect. Of course, we're not going to check ourselves. Whereas I always see it as my role to kind of try to highlight the sheer fallacies in the points that people who try to uphold this prejudice make. I would always say that racism and stupidity go hand in hand. It's a match made in heaven. And my role was always to try to not go after the person who's that prejudice because second nature to them, because the reality is that often times not going to change. It is the moderate. It is the Amy in Central Park who claims to be a lifelong Democrat, but swiftly picks up the phone and calls the cops on a black man who is taking photos of birds in Central Park because she, quote unquote, feels threatened. So it's people like that who feel like they are down with the cause and feel like they believe and are progressive. And then all of a sudden, when it comes down to it, you swiftly realize that prejudice that they've been withholding within themselves has gone unchecked for so long. So the role of white people who consider themselves allies, as Rihanna said, are you pulling up when the cameras aren't on? Like, or is it's when it's all well and good to share the black squares on Instagram and go to the marches because it's now popular. Like, what are you doing? Are you focusing on local elections? Are you looking at someone like Jackie Lacey in LA, who Kendrick Sampson was just holding an amazing movement against someone who is a person of color, but has been upholding these policies that have been incarcerating and targeting minority communities? Are you looking at the specifics in each election to make sure that you're doing the work, the grassroots work, to give voices to those who are being silenced and those that are marginalized in certain areas? And I guess the most important one, which seems like a cliche, but it is the reason why it continues to be a stain on the fabric of the nation, is, are you listening?
Yeah.
Because that's the most important thing. Are you actually listening? And people want to talk before they've even listened what happens. And I come from like a sociology background, and I always look at things from a sociological perspective, and it's all about the idea of empathy is to not essentially put yourself in other people's shoes, but people conflate that with, oh, well, I put myself in their shoes, so I'm going to act this way. Well, are you taking into consideration the fact that you're not in that person's shoes, and there is certain things that go into why those decisions are made in preferential to that group of people instead of you? So I guess amidst that muddled answer, I just try my best to not beat around the bush in calling out the specific group of people that, in order for real change to happen, and the reason we're in this, as Baldwin says, trapped in a history, and history's trapped in us, is because we don't listen enough, and we don't pay attention to the moderates that get away with just sharing the black squares and don't actually show up when it's needed.
Yeah, can I just say something really quickly on that note? And I know I fully am self-aware that I interrupted Francis as he was saying we don't listen enough. So I apologize for that. No. I want to just hold myself accountable. Because I appreciate that. I want to think a little bit deeper of what you were presenting about white women and white supremacy, which is, we get accused of playing identity politics or making things about race, but they're the ones actually playing into identity politics and making things about race, because why would you choose your whiteness over gender solidarity? And so, not that you have to make those two choices differently, but that's a clear choice that was made. And so how we have to understand this is we'll give one issue that makes it very clear, which is abortion, right? So that's why Amy Coney Barrett was so properly speeded through by the Republicans. And even, we have to be honest, in my community, in other communities of color, they are sometimes socially conservative and appreciated being anti-abortion. So what that comes down to is that white people don't care about us having abortions. That's why they're performing hysterectomies at the border. They don't care if we stop having babies. They care if white women stop having babies, because they're obsessed with this demographic shift, which, I'm sorry to break it for folks, it's not 2042, it's now. It already happened. The demographic shift has always happened or always been present in America, but it's been about who has been disenfranchised or intimidated to vote, or whose vote has been suppressed, and then doesn't reflect the real demographics of this country. So after Obama got elected, of course, this is like a manifestation of centuries of white supremacy, but a group of white supremacists met in Tennessee, and they said, our framing narrative is we have to popularize the white genocide that's happening in this country, where we're gonna lose a grip, we're gonna lose a hold of this country. And of course, who they squarely focused in on was the reproductive labor of white women. So if white women aren't put back in and re-domesticated and forced to have babies, this is the Handmaid's Tale. This is like clearly it. Then we are going to die as a race. And you see this if you look at white supremacist like sites that sometimes masquerade as these benign I love white people Facebook groups. All their memes are anti-miscegenation and about men of color raping white women. Why did Trump start with Mexicans are rapists? It was very clear pandering to that fear that men of color are going to rape white women and pollute the race of whiteness. That's what he was talking to. Why was he calling for white suburban women, love me, vote for me? He was trying to scare them about Black men, right? So we have to think about really the infrared ways that race is being played to solidify the white woman's role to be a baby maker for white supremacy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that in addition to using abortion as a means to further oppress women of color through the laws, it also facilitates a world where white women whose numbers in sterility have gone up, and they're very worried about those numbers from the census,